I never asked the widow's name before I offered to fix her fence. That was my first mistake, though I wouldn't understand the size of it for another 3 weeks. I was passing through on the North Road out of Laramie with nothing but a bedroll, $41, and a reason to keep moving that I didn't tell anyone about. Her fence was down in 3 places along the west pasture, and when I stopped to water my horse at her creek, she came out onto the porch with a shotgun she didn't quite know how to hold and asked me what business I had on her land. I told her I had none. I told her the water looked clean and my horse was thirsty. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that measures a man by the wear on his boots and the dirt under his nails, not by what he says. And then she lowered the gun an inch and told me the fence had been down since March and she hadn't the money to hire it fixed. I said I'd do it for a meal. She said she couldn't promise much of one. I said that was fine. Looking back, that was the moment everything started going wrong, though at the time it felt like the first right thing I'd done in a year. That first meal was thin, cornmeal mush and a heel of bread, no meat, though she apologized for it twice, as if a stranger who'd shown up uninvited had any right to complain. I ate what she gave me and didn't ask for more, though I noticed the flour barrel in the corner of her kitchen was down to a few inches of gray dust at the bottom, and I understood before she ever said a word about money that this was a woman counting every cent between now and whatever came next. A pound of flour ran 3 to 5 cents at most general stores that far out from the rail line, and even that small a thing had become a calculation she made every morning. I slept in the barn loft that night on a horse blanket, and I lay awake a long while listening to the wind work against the boards and thinking that I had not felt this close to still in longer than I could remember. Her name was Naomi. I learned that 3 days later when I was still there, and by then I'd already decided I wasn't leaving until the fence was whole, though I told myself it was only about the fence.
The Whitfield place sat in a shallow bowl of land along Clear Fork Creek, 40 miles northwest of Laramie, in country where the grass went gold by August and the wind never fully stopped. Naomi's husband, Thomas, had filed the homestead claim in 1876 under the act that gave a man 160 acres if he could prove up the land, build on it, work it, live on it for 5 years running. Thomas had done all of that. He'd built a 2-room cabin with his own hands, dug a well he never had to use because the creek ran close enough, and fenced 60 acres for cattle he never got the chance to buy in any real number. He died 2 winters back, thrown from a horse in a snowstorm not a half-mile from his own porch, and Naomi had spent every day since proving up a claim that was legally hers, but that half the valley still spoke of though it belonged to a dead man. She had a boy, Eli, 7 years old, with his father's sandy hair and a gap in his front teeth he was proud of in the way only a boy that age can be proud of something broken. He watched me work on the fence from the porch steps for the better part of that first afternoon, not saying anything, just watching, until finally he asked if I'd ever shot a man. I told him no. It wasn't the truth, but it wasn't a lie a 7-year-old needed carrying around either. If she lost the water, she'd lose the land. That was the plain fact of it, and I didn't understand how close she was to losing it until the second night, when I was splitting wood by the barn and I heard raised voices from the porch. A man named Cyrus had ridden up with 2 of his hands flanking him, sitting his horse like a man who owned the ground it stood on. He ran the Circle B outfit to the east, 11,000 acres and growing, most of it dry range that needed Clear Fork's water to keep his herds alive through August. He sat his horse easy, one gloved hand resting on the saddle horn, and he spoke the way a man speaks when he's rehearsed the conversation and already knows how it ends. He told Naomi, plain as reading a grocery list, that he intended to file a formal water claim on the creek at the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, and that her husband's claim, filed under a different water doctrine before the territory had settled its rules on the matter, might not hold up to a legal challenge. He said he always respected Thomas, and that he took no pleasure in this, and that he'd even be willing to let her keep the house and a few acres around it once the matter was settled, as though that were a kindness rather than the shape of the very thing he intended to take from her. I stood by the woodpile the whole time, splitting log after log I didn't need to split, watching his men watch me the way men watch a stranger they haven't yet decided whether to worry about. He said it kindly. That was the worst part. He said it the way a man says something he's already decided is true and is only being polite enough to warn you about it first.
I rode into the nearest town 2 mornings later for nails and wire, and while I waited at the mercantile counter, I heard enough talk to understand the shape of things without having to ask a single question. An old rancher near the door said the Circle B had already put together a herd of better than 2,000 head for the season, and that no dry range in the territory could carry a herd that size past July without a second water source. Another man, younger, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some accident with a baling wire, said Cyrus had come up from Texas 15 years back with nothing but a trail herd and a hard eye for opportunity, and that a trail drive in those days ran a man close to 3 months and 1,000 miles from the Texas ranges up to the railheads at Abilene or Dodge, losing cattle to river crossings and stampedes the whole way, so that a man who survived that kind of work twice over wasn't inclined to let a widow's ditch stand between him and easier grass. Wyoming Range ran on a simple rule when it came to water, one that went back further than most of the laws written down in Cheyenne. First in time, first in right. Whoever put the water to use first held the strongest claim, and it didn't matter how many miles of range a man owned if his neighbor had been drawn from that creek a full year before him. Thomas had dug an irrigation ditch off Clear Fork in the spring of 1877, the year after he filed his claim, and if that ditch could be proven older than anything Cyrus had built off the same creek, the water was Naomi's by right. But proof took paper, and paper took a trip to the land office, and a trip to the land office took money and time Naomi didn't have, with planting season bearing down and a boy to feed, and not a soul in the valley willing to ride against the Circle B on her behalf. I told myself I would stay until the fence was mended. And then I told myself I'd stay until I'd cut enough wood to see her through if an early frost came. And then I told myself a dozen more reasons, each one thinner than the last, until one evening Naomi caught me in the lie without either of us saying a word about it. She'd made stew from a hen too old to lay anymore, and we sat on the porch steps eating while Eli chased fireflies in the yard, and she said, not looking at me, that I didn't seem like a man who stayed anywhere long. I said she was right. She asked why I was still here. I opened my mouth to answer and found I didn't have one that was true, and the silence that followed said more than any answer would have. I had a wound of my own, though I hadn't spoken it aloud to another living soul in 3 years. I'd worked as a hired gun out of Dodge City, and in the spring of 1880 I'd been paid to ride escort for a cattle baron's land claim, the kind of job where you don't ask questions about the men on the other side of the dispute, only about your wages. There'd been a family on that land first, a homestead not unlike this one, and when the dispute turned to gunfire, a man died who had no more business dying than I had business being there. I hadn't pulled the trigger that killed him. I'd pulled a trigger that day all the same, and I had spent every mile since trying to outrun the particular kind of quiet that follows a man after something like that. I saw Thomas Whitfield's grave the second morning, up on the rise behind the cabin, marked with a plain wooden cross and a ring of white stones Eli had clearly gathered and placed himself, some of them still crooked from small hands that hadn't quite gotten the shape right. I stood there a long while before I noticed the boy had followed me up the rise and was standing a few feet off, watching me the way he watched most things, quiet and careful. He asked if I'd known his father. I told him no. He said his father used to say a man's word was the only thing he really owned, and that everything else could be taken from him by weather or by other men, but nobody could take a word once it was given honestly. I didn't say anything back to that, because I was thinking of every word I'd given dishonestly in the 3 years since Dodge City, and how little of what I owned, by that measure, actually belonged to me. I understood with a clarity that frightened me that I had spent 3 years running from the wrong side of exactly this story. And here I was, standing on the right side of it for the first time, not knowing what to do with my own hands. The first real trouble came on a Thursday, when 2 of Cyrus's men rode the fence line and cut the wire I'd strung not 4 days before, letting Naomi's 6 head of cattle scatter across the open range, where the Circle B's larger herd would trample any claim she had to the grazing rights that ran alongside the water. I found the cut wire before dawn and rode out after the strays with Naomi beside me, the 2 of us pushing cattle through sagebrush until our hands bled from the wire and rope. And it was there, chasing a red heifer through a stand of cottonwoods along the creek, that I first understood how strong she was. Not strong in the way men talk about strength, all muscle and stubbornness, but strong in the way that doesn't announce itself. The kind that gets up every morning and does the next necessary thing without waiting for someone to tell her she's allowed to be tired. The morning had started long before dawn, both of us moving through gray half-light with lanterns swinging off our saddle horns, calling low to cattle that didn't want to be found. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, the whole valley smelled of crushed sage and horse sweat, and my shirt was soaked through and stuck to my back, and still we kept riding, pushing that red heifer through brush that tore at both our sleeves. Naomi rode the way a woman rides who learned it out of necessity rather than pleasure, sitting the saddle a little too stiff, gripping the reins a little too tight. But she never once fell behind, and twice she caught a stray I would have lost on my own, cutting it back toward the herd with a shout that startled a pair of magpies out of the cottonwoods. We got the cattle back by noon, and when we stopped to water the horses, she sat down hard on a fallen log and put her face in her hands, and for the first time since I'd known her, she let herself cry. I sat beside her, close but not touching, listening to the creek move over the stones and Eli's laughter carrying faintly from somewhere back near the barn, where he'd stayed behind that morning to mind the chickens. The cottonwood leaves overhead threw moving shadows across her hands, and I remember thinking that I could count on one hand the number of quiet moments I'd allowed myself in the last 3 years, and here was another one, sitting beside a woman crying over cattle and water rights in a dead man's ditch, and I didn't want to be anywhere else on earth. I told her I would ride to Cheyenne myself and find the paper proof of Thomas's ditch and stand as witness if it came to a hearing. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between gratitude and warning, and said I didn't owe her that. I said I knew I didn't. I never told her the real reason I needed to do it, which was that I was tired of being a man who only showed up on the wrong side of things. She turned to face me on that log, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. Her lips parted like she meant to speak. I felt something in my chest go still and waiting, the particular held breath feeling of a moment about to become something else entirely. And then a shot rang out from the direction of the house, not aimed at us, just a warning fired into the air by one of Cyrus's men making a show of watching the property. And the moment broke apart before either of us could say what it might have become. I rode to Cheyenne 2 days later, 110 miles round trip, and I told Naomi I'd be back within the week. The land office was a squat brick building on a dusty street lined with false-fronted saloons and a mercantile advertising flour at 4 cents a pound, cheaper than most towns that far from the rail line. I spent the first day being turned away from 3 different counters by clerks who couldn't be bothered to look up from their own paperwork, and I came to understand that a land office in a territorial capital ran on the same currency as everything else out there: patience and the willingness to ask the same question of 5 different men until one of them finally answered it. I slept that first night in a boarding house that charged 50 cents for a bed and a wash basin, counting out coins I'd meant to save for something else. And I thought of Naomi doing the same kind of counting back at the homestead, every cent measured against what stood between her and losing everything. I spent the second full day going through filing records with a clerk who seemed to enjoy watching a stranger sweat over paperwork. And on the second afternoon, I found it. Thomas Whitfield's original ditch filing, dated the 14th of June, 1877, a full 8 months before any water claim the Circle B had ever registered on Clear Fork. It was there, in black ink, plain as anything, proof enough to end the dispute outright if I could get it certified and back to the valley before Cyrus's own filing went through unopposed. I should have ridden straight back. Instead, I did something I still can't fully explain, except to say that 3 years of running had left habits in me that didn't disappear just because I wanted them to. I stopped at a saloon that night, told myself it was one drink to steady my nerves before the ride, and ran into a man I'd worked with in Dodge City, a man who recognized me, who said my name too loud in a room full of strangers, who asked whether I was still in the business of clearing land disputes for whoever paid best. I told him no. I told him I was done with that line of work entirely. He laughed like I'd told a joke he didn't quite believe, and said men like us didn't get to be done with it. We only got to be between jobs, and he raised his glass to that as if it were a toast worth making. I didn't raise mine back. I set down money for both drinks and walked out before he could say anything more. But the words followed me into the street all the same, and I stood there a long moment under a sky gone the color of a bruise, listening to piano music leaking out of every saloon on the block, and I understood that whatever peace I'd found at the Whitfield place had been built on the hope that my past wouldn't come looking for me, and now it had, in the shape of a stranger's memory in a Cheyenne saloon. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking of Naomi's face when I told her I'd ride to Cheyenne for her, how she'd looked at me like I was a man worth trusting with something that mattered, and how little I'd done up to that point to have earned it. I rode back to the valley slower than I should have, turning the encounter over in my mind, wondering whether Naomi deserved to know what kind of man had been splitting her wood and mending her fence. I decided, somewhere on that 110 miles of open road, that she did deserve to know, and that I would tell her the moment I arrived, before I handed her the paper, before anything else happened between us. I never got the chance to tell her on my own terms. When I rode into the yard, Cyrus was already there, sitting his horse near the porch with the same 2 hands flanking him as before, and he was holding a letter of his own, a notice that his filing had gone through the territorial office 3 days prior, faster than mine, backed by money and connections that a widow with 160 acres could never match. He told Naomi, in that same patient, terrible voice, that the matter would go before a territorial judge inside the month, and that judges in that territory had a way of finding for men who could afford good lawyers. That night was the dark one. Naomi sat at her kitchen table with the certified copy of Thomas's ditch filing spread out in front of her, next to Cyrus's notice, and she said, very quietly, that it wouldn't matter. She said a judge would look at a piece of paper filed by a widow against a filing backed by the Circle B's lawyers and find a reason, somehow, to rule the way money wanted him to rule. She said she was tired of fighting for ground that the whole valley seemed to think should have gone to someone stronger the moment Thomas died. She said maybe it was time to sell what she could and take Eli somewhere the fight wasn't waiting for her every morning. She said she'd heard of women doing exactly that, taking whatever a buyer would pay for a proved-up claim and starting over in some rail town where nobody knew the name Whitfield or cared whose ditch had been dug first. She said it in a flat, tired voice, like a woman reciting a plan she didn't believe in but couldn't think past. I told her I didn't believe that. She looked at me and asked plainly why I cared so much about a piece of land that wasn't mine, and I understood that the moment had come to tell her everything, and instead, I said nothing at all, because I was more afraid of her turning that same tired, disappointed look on me than I was of losing the fight itself. I left the kitchen that night without saying the thing I'd promised myself I'd say, and I lay awake in the barn loft listening to the wind and thinking that I had become, in my silence, exactly the kind of man who lets the people he cares about carry a weight alone, rather than risk being seen clearly. The turning point came from a place I didn't expect. Eli found me in the barn the next morning before sunup, sitting on an overturned bucket with his father's old pocket knife in his hands, whittling badly at a piece of scrap wood. He asked me if I was going to leave now that Cyrus had won. I told him nothing was decided yet. He said his mother thought it was. Then he said something that undid 3 years of careful distance in about 4 words. He said he didn't want another man to leave. He didn't mean it as an accusation. He said it the way children say the truest things, without knowing the weight of them. And I sat there with that weight settling into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I asked him what he meant by another man. He looked down at the pocket knife in his hands and told me, in the plain, unadorned way of a boy who hadn't yet learned to soften hard facts for the comfort of adults, that a man from town had come around twice that past winter asking his mother to marry him, and that she'd said no both times, and that after the second time the man had stopped coming around at all, the way most things that mattered to Eli seemed to stop coming around eventually. I didn't have an answer for that either. Not one I trusted myself to say out loud yet, so I told him I wasn't planning on going anywhere today, which was true, and which seemed to be enough for a boy his age, though I understood it wouldn't be enough forever. I found Naomi at the creek that morning, kneeling at the edge of the water with her hands in the current, and I told her everything. I told her about Dodge City, about the family on the land that wasn't mine to defend, about the man who died because of a job I'd taken for wages, about 3 years of riding without a destination because I didn't believe I'd earned the right to stop anywhere. I told her I hadn't come back to the valley just to hand her a piece of paper. I'd come back because for the first time since that spring in 1880, I wanted to stand on the side of something worth standing on, even if it cost me. I told her if that changed how she saw me. She was quiet for a long time, still kneeling there with the water moving past her hands. Then she said something I hadn't expected, that she'd buried a husband who never told her when he was afraid, who carried every hard thing alone because he thought that was what strength meant, and that watching me finally say a hard thing out loud, even 3 weeks too late, told her more about the kind of man I was than my silence ever could have. She said the wound in a person doesn't disappear because they finally speak it. It just stops being something they carry by themselves. She said Thomas had carried his fears alone right up until the morning he rode out into a snowstorm he should have waited out, and she would always wonder whether a shared burden might have kept him home that day. She wasn't asking me to replace him. She was only telling me, in her own careful way, what silence had already cost her once. I understood, kneeling there beside her with the creek running cold over both our hands, that she wasn't offering forgiveness for something that needed forgiven. She was offering to stand where I stood, the way I'd been trying to stand where she stood, without either of us quite saying it plainly. We stayed there a long while after that, past the point where either of us had any real reason to, watching the water move over the rocks the way it had moved for longer than either of our families had held claim to it. She asked, eventually, what I intended to do once the water rights were settled one way or the other, whether I'd ride on the way I always had. I told her I didn't know yet, and that was the truest answer I'd given anyone in 3 years. She said that was fair. She didn't ask me to promise anything, and I understood that not asking was its own kind of gift, one that left the choosing entirely to me instead of taking it from me the way every other turn in my life seemed to have been taken. We rode back to the house side by side as the light went long and gold across the grass, and neither of us hurried the horses. The hearing came 11 days later, in a borrowed room above the Mercantile in the nearest town, before a circuit judge who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Cyrus brought a lawyer from Cheyenne in a fine gray suit who spoke for the better part of an hour about range rights, capital investment, and the future prosperity of the territory, as though those things carried more weight in the eyes of the law than 8 months of dated ink. Naomi brought the certified ditch filing, a neighbor named Hollis who'd worked cattle alongside Thomas and was willing to testify under oath that he'd seen Thomas digging that ditch with his own 2 hands in the spring of 1877, back before the Circle B had ever run a single head of cattle within 10 miles of Clear Fork, and me, standing at the back of the room in my one clean shirt, ready to say whatever needed saying about what I'd found in the land office records. Naomi herself spoke last before the judge called for his decision, and she didn't raise her voice or plead. She simply told him that her husband had built a life on that ground with nothing but his own hands and 160 acres the government had promised him if he could prove it worth keeping, and that she intended to keep proving it with or without the water for as long as she and her son had breath to do it. The room went quiet in a way that even Cyrus's lawyer seemed to feel. It didn't take the judge long after that. 8 months of prior use was 8 months, whether the ditch belonged to a cattle baron or a widow, and the law, for once, did what the law was supposed to do. Cyrus took the ruling the way a man takes a business loss, with a curt nod and no apology, and rode out of town without another word to either of us. Hollis shook my hand outside on the boardwalk afterward and said he'd known Thomas well enough to know he'd have been glad of the company his widow had found, and I didn't correct him, though I wasn't sure yet what word belonged to whatever Naomi and I were to each other. Naomi didn't celebrate the way I expected. She stood on the mercantile steps afterward with the ruling in her hand, and she looked out at the street for a long moment before she said quietly that Thomas would have liked knowing his ditch had finally done its work. Then she looked at me, and there was something in her face that hadn't been there before. Not relief exactly, something steadier than that. I didn't leave the valley that week, or the one after. Autumn came on slow, the cottonwoods along the creek turning the color of old brass, and the work of a homestead didn't pause to notice that anything between Naomi and me had shifted. There was hay to put up, a root cellar to dig deeper before the ground froze, a second horse to break to harness so the place could run without hired help come spring. I did that work alongside her without either of us naming what it meant that I was still there. And some evenings Isla would sit between us on the porch steps asking questions about everywhere I'd ever ridden through, and I found myself telling him the true parts of those stories instead of the ones I used to tell to keep men at a comfortable distance. Naomi listened too on those evenings, mending some torn shirt or another by lamplight, and once or twice I caught her watching me instead of her needle, and neither of us looked away as quickly as we might have a month before. There was no grand declaration, no moment where either of us said the words that might have belonged in a story with a tidier ending. What there was, instead, was a Tuesday evening in October when I came in from mending the last stretch of fence and found my chair, the one I'd taken to using on the porch without ever being told I could, moved a few inches closer to the fire than it had been that morning. Naomi didn't say anything about it. She just handed me a plate and sat down beside me, and Isla fell asleep between us before the stew had gone cold, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods the way it always had, indifferent to whatever had finally settled, quiet and certain in that small room. Outside, the last of the daylight caught the water where it ran along the fence line Naomi and Thomas had built together, the water that had nearly cost her everything, and instead become the thing that kept us both rooted to that valley, quiet and moving and entirely hers by right. She never asked me to stay. She just moved my chair closer to the fire.